Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you this evening. Thanks to everyone who worked on... Oh, it's not loud enough? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Shout again if I might start doing this, and then you need to shout if you can't hear. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who was involved in putting this together, for bringing me here to talk with you this evening. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I hope we have quite a lot of time for discussion, because as Olga was indicating, a lot of these things are very intimate for us and immediate for us, so we need to thrash it out, talk it through. And of course, it's an honor to deliver the Wertheim lecture. Since learning about him, I've been intrigued by this colonial administrator who turned against colonialism, this Orientalist who turned against Orientalism, this bourgeois who turned against the bourgeoisie, it seems. And his work is, of course, relevant to the question I'll be discussing today of racism, the struggle against it, and the kinds of knowledge we need in that struggle. It was his frustration with racial discrimination in colonial Indonesia during the 1940s that seems to have opened up a broader questioning of European colonialism and neocolonialism for him. And what Wertheim points to for us, I think, is precisely that link between racism and colonialism. And racism in Europe today, whether you think of the political mobilizations of the far right, whether you think of the border policies that cause the deaths of tens of thousands of people by drowning in the Mediterranean, whether you think of police violence, all of that cannot be understood outside of Europe's history and ongoing practices of colonialism and neocolonialism. And Wertheim's willingness to risk his own academic career in speaking out against European colonialism and questioning the role of universities in supporting it exemplifies, I think, the bravery and commitment we still need, especially in relation to the most important anti-colonial cause today, which is the Palestinian liberation movement. Now, as a way to introduce my argument about anti-racism at the present time, I want to begin by talking about the National Memorial and Museum that's located in a part of the site of the Vught concentration camp here in the Netherlands. So the memorial, if any of you have ever been there, you'll know, is spread out over several buildings and outdoor areas. The main building is a museum with exhibits on the history of the concentration camp and of Nazism in Europe. And then outside are life-size reconstructions of the camp's living quarters, the watchtowers, the barbed wire fences. And there's commemorations of the people who were murdered in Vught or after passing through it. We learn that the first prisoners arrived at Vught in January 1943, and that over the following year, most of the Jews who were rounded up by the Nazis in the Netherlands were sent to Vught, where they faced starvation, disease, summary executions, or transportation to the extermination camps in Germany and Poland. The final part of the memorial that you walk through is a reflection room, where several short films aim to tie the camp's history to what it calls the here and now. And written on the wall in large type is the question, how do you make a difference? The films answer with the message that you should not be a bystander when you see others needing help. The examples the films choose have nothing to do with racism, with the exception of one film entitled Not Everything is What It Seems. And this film presents three characters discussing stereotypes. A blonde woman talks about how people assume she is unintelligent. A white man with tattoos explains that people sometimes think of him as white trash. A North African man says people are surprised by how well he speaks Dutch. So in the memorial's understanding of anti-racism here, we all make unfounded assumptions about others based on their appearances, but education can help us overcome these prejudices. Racism on this view is about unconscious biases that arise through maybe unfamiliarity. Cultural awareness, getting to know others, and engaging in self-reflection are the remedies. The lesson of Nazism on this account is that if individual prejudices are not challenged, then emotionally manipulative propaganda can exploit these irrational biases to mount a totalitarian assault on liberal government. But there's another way of thinking about anti-racism that's also present in Vught's history, though it's not displayed in the memorial. Among the prisoners at Vught was Anton de Kom, who had been a leader of the struggle against Dutch colonialism in Suriname. His 1934 book, We Slaves of Suriname, traces the long history of resistance to European rule, from the indigenous, what he calls red slaves, through to the guerrilla wars waged by bands of escaped Africans against the plantation system, and the struggles of indentured workers from India and Indonesia. All these he describes as the slaves that are in the book's title. De Kom demonstrated that slavery did not end with its abolition in 1863, but continued in new forms. The Dutch, he wrote, arranged emancipation in such a way that the freed slaves had no other choice but to voluntarily take up the slavery which had just been legally abolished. Under the colonial system, the various categories of labour were not truly free because they were still, as he says, forced to sell their labour power, albeit in a different way than during the days of slavery. The plantation system's physical pains have mostly been replaced by mental torture, poverty and deprivation, he says. De Kom was exiled from Suriname by the colonial authorities because of his organising against Dutch imperialism. So he was in the Netherlands when the Nazis invaded and joined the resistance. In August 1944, he was betrayed by an associate and arrested. And then after a period at Vught, he was transported to the camp at Sandbostel and annexed to the Neuengamme concentration camp in Germany, where he died of tuberculosis in April 1945 at the age of 47. He was one of perhaps 2,000 black people who died in the Nazi camps. By the way, I might add here that one of the prisoners at Vught at the same time in 1943 was my grandfather, Henricus van Hachten, who had worked as a bookkeeper at the town hall in Roermond and was arrested by the Nazis for what they call unlawful dealings with ration cards, apparently in an attempt to help Jews in hiding. And he was released after about 6 months. The silences at the Vught site are, I think, more significant than the explicit content. De Kom is remembered as simply another category of victim of the Nazis. But what's not allowed is that his analysis of racism might be permitted to change our minds about what racism is. And if we did that, we would have to consider the possibility that racism is not ultimately about unconscious biases arriving from unfamiliarity, nor is it even fundamentally a psychological disposition, a mental attitude, or an irrational doctrine, as liberals tend to believe. For De Kom, it was a structure for organising different forms of labour relationship under capitalism. Race enabled the naturalising and dehistoricising of difference, so that the enslaved, the indentured, and the indigenous could be denied the rights of contract and wage that capitalism presented as its defining forms of labour. Of course, racism expresses itself in individual irrational attitudes, but De Kom tells us that these attitudes are themselves the result of deeper social and economic forces. And on his account, racism is also constantly evolving. In the face of resistance, it reconstitutes itself in new forms, from the plantation system to the racially segmented labour systems of European colonialism in the early 20th century when he's writing. He understood that when that happened, the espousal of liberal values could mask new systems of oppression. But there's another silence at Vught that should be deeply disturbing but seems to pass unnoticed. Walking around the grounds of the memorial, it's impossible not to notice that alongside one of the walls of the memorial is a much taller wall topped with barbed wire and closed-circuit TV cameras. On the other side of that wall are prison buildings. Their arrangement mirrors that of the memorial's reconstructed camp buildings. The memorial, in fact, takes up only a small part of the original concentration camp site, A larger part is occupied by a functioning prison. And if you look left from the memorial's main entrance, the tall metal doors of the prison entrance are visible, flanked by lines of people waiting to visit inmates. Many are women wearing hijabs and niqabs, a result of the fact that the Vught prison includes a high-security unit where anyone suspected or convicted of being a terrorist or a so-called Islamic radicalizer is automatically separated from other prisoners and held under especially punitive conditions. Because almost all of those imprisoned there are Muslims, the unit has come to be known informally as a Muslim detention centre. Dutch prison authorities opened the high security unit in 2006 at the behest of the Domestic Intelligence Agency, the AIVD. These agencies organised a regime in the unit to prevent its prisoners from having any meaningful contact with other human beings. Prisoners are isolated and confined for up to 22 hours per day. One woman imprisoned there, who was eventually acquitted of all charges, spent 2 full stretchers, one for 10 consecutive weeks and the other for 3, cut off from anyone else. Former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Y. Mendez, has said that, based on the medical evidence, solitary confinement for longer than 15 days can amount to torture when used during pre-trial detention or as a punishment, and therefore should be absolutely prohibited. Approximately 170 prisoners were held in the high-security unit at Vught in its first 10 years of operation. The majority were not convicted of a crime but were awaiting trial, which can take up to 27 months. Among those at Vught who had been convicted were a woman found guilty after retweeting a single tweet that allegedly encouraged people to fight in Syria, and a man convicted for giving €1,000 to a childhood friend who had travelled to Syria. These are terrorism offences under the Dutch counter-terrorism laws that emerged in the first decade of this century. Now, the regime of extreme isolation, humiliating searches, and continuous monitoring at the Vught High Security Unit is modelled on those that operate at so-called supermax prisons in the United States. Now, the idea behind these prisons emerged in the 1960s in the context of black prisoners resisting their treatment. Academic psychologists working with the Federal Bureau of Prisons in the United States proposed that if you isolate prisoners, it could be a way of carrying out what they called behaviour modification. The purpose was to break inmates down to a kind of blank slate upon which a new, more docile personality could be constructed. So by the 21st century, you have about 9% of black men in the United States have been held in solitary for more than 15 consecutive days. That's the definition of mental torture. And nearly 1 in 100 have experienced solitary for a year or longer by the age of 32. Now, in the first decade of the 21st century, this US system of supermax prisons was globalized. The sites that emerged during the global war on terror at Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, Bagram, and countless other places followed this supermax model. And Vught is a part of this global infrastructure of counterterrorism supermax incarceration that imprisons so-called Muslim extremists around the world. It's a site built by the Nazis to carry out the genocide of Jews that has then served as a Muslim detention centre where people are in effect tortured. So the visitors to the memorial at Vught are literally bystanders to racist oppression taking place on another part of the site. Now, what happened at Vught in 1943 and 1944, and what happens there in the 21st century, are, of course, not equivalent. Yet neither of the uses to which the camp has been put in these two periods entirely separable. The Nazis, with their final solution, aimed at the complete elimination of European Jewry, and incarceration was a means to that end. The European and United States governments that have implemented a global war on terror have a different aim. Their goal is the integration of Muslims into what they call liberal society. And at the ideological centre of this project is a distinction between the moderate Muslim and the extremist Muslim, who is closely linked to the figure of the Palestinian terrorist. The moderate is offered a form of inclusion, the extremist is subjected to state violence. But since the perception of the moderate is that they are always at risk of becoming an extremist, all Muslims are continually suspect. Moderate Muslims are defined as those who restrict their religion to the private sphere, but they're also expected to publicly condemn interpretations of Islam that Western governments consider dangerous. Moderate Muslims are supposed to value freedom of speech, but they're considered extremists if they use their freedom of speech to criticize the West. Moderate Muslims are required to publicly condemn the use of violence to achieve political ends, but when Western governments use violence to achieve its political ends, condemnation must give way to consent. In the 21st century, the figures of the Muslim extremist and the Palestinian terrorist have been deployed to justify multiple wars of mass elimination, what can plausibly be called genocides. We do not know how many unnecessary deaths resulted from the US-led wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan and Iraq. But when the full destructive effects of these wars are taken into account, the real death toll is likely to be well over 1 million human souls. At the same time, the West's wars have forced over 14 million Iraqis and Afghans to flee their homes in fear of their lives, while the wealthy countries who share responsibility for their displacement violently prevent them from seeking sanctuary. And then there is the Zionist war of annihilation in Palestine, including its extensions to southern Lebanon and now Iran. The death toll in Gaza, again, cannot be known with any accuracy, but it must be well over 100,000 people. The aim is to make Gaza permanently unlivable, which corresponds to Raphael Lemkin's original definition of genocide as actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of a national group. The central defense of Zionism since the late 1960s has been that the domination of Palestinians is necessary because they are terrorists and extremists. Zionist colonialism presents itself also as a war on terrorism. And so anti-Palestinian racism becomes indispensable here, because only by imagining barbarism as somehow a natural feature of Palestinians can war, torture, assassination and arbitrary imprisonment be justified on this scale. So racism here functions by setting aside the colonial oppression that creates the conditions in which some Palestinians do indeed commit terrifying acts of violence, and instead seeing their actions as simply the expression of an inherent culture of fanaticism. We can then tell ourselves that their violence reflects the deep flaws of their culture, while our much greater violence is a rational, even liberal response aimed at modifying their barbaric behaviour. Genocidal violence does not always announce itself in the rhetoric of overt hatred. It can also be hidden by the managerial language of cultural reform. And that was precisely the thinking of the AIVD, the Dutch agency that encouraged the opening of the high security unit at Vught. It presented Vuht's high security unit as a response to what it called the radicalization that it believed was happening amongst Muslim inmates. Echoing the logic of US prison regimes, the purpose of extreme isolation at Vught was to break down the personalities of extremist Muslims and remold them as moderate Muslims, part of this broader program of violently imposed cultural change. Vught is thus a place haunted by the presence of multiple forms of oppression. Nazi anti-Semitism instigated the construction of the original site of incarceration. Dutch colonialism led to the imprisonment of one of its detainees, Anton de Kom. Black revolutionary Anton de Kom. The war on terror shaped a new logic of confinement decades later, influenced by US practices that were responses to black-led prison rebellion. All of these different oppressions could be described using the term racism, yet most of these racisms remain invisible. The usual assumption is that what happened in the past at Vught in the 1940s is the defining example of racism, the Nazi genocide, while what happens there now has nothing to do with racism, right? So at a site to commemorate Nazism, we become bystanders to the other racisms that surround us. Now, the liberal version of anti-racism presented at the Vught Memorial, which sees racism as essentially a matter of irrational beliefs and attitudes, can be seen emerging in Europe and the United States in the 1930s and 40s, largely in response to Nazism. One of the pioneers, for example, was Magnus Hirschfeld. As a Jewish gay rights campaigner and well-known sexologist, he was exiled when Hitler came to power and wrote his book Rassismus in German in response. When it was translated into English in 1938 as racism, it was the first time that that word had been used in an English language scholarly text. In the book, Hirschfeld analyzes the racial theories that had been developed from the Enlightenment through to the 20th century and shows how these theories were no longer scientifically credible. The problem was, he argued, that these ideas had been planted in people's minds and were now held onto irrationally, even though science had moved on. He concluded that in societies where racial prejudices were widespread, liberal democracy could be undermined by political extremists inflaming race hatred to gain power. To remove this danger, he called on the liberal university, the intellectuals, to persuade the masses, especially the poor and uneducated, that racist opinions have no legitimate scientific basis. So this argument was pursued in a similar way in the United States by Ruth Benedict, the anthropologist. At the outbreak of World War II, she decided to write a book of popular science that she hoped would serve as a kind of handbook for what she called tolerance education. And this was published in 1940 with the title Race, Science and Politics. And the book argues that achievements in art and invention are evenly distributed across different cultures. Now, what motivated these initiatives of the 1940s was the sense that racism threatened liberal government and could, as had happened in Germany, completely overwhelm it. And this fear led the normally cloistered biologists and anthropologists and social psychologists to become the kind of public faces of a new anti-racist practical politics, mobilizing the authority of their academic credentials to counter the scientific pretensions of racism. Irrational dogma was the problem, and anti-racist expertise was the solution. Above all, these liberal anti-racists clung to their belief that racist attitudes could be gradually eliminated by well-meaning intellectuals cultivating attitudes of rationality, tolerance, and the celebration of diversity, as Benedict and Hirschfeld had proposed. So on this view, universities have a kind of heroic role to play in challenging racism and saving liberal democracy from the threat of extremism. But it also meant a version of anti-racism that often reduced itself to a moralistic, top-down program of unmasking false ideas and rooting out improper attitudes. Liberal anti-racism also brought out the long-standing tension in how universities saw their place in society. Of course, academics are supposed to be reluctant to have anything that might resemble a political agenda. Their only allowed ethical commitment is supposed to be the search for scientific knowledge itself. Academia is regarded on this view as kind of floating up in the clouds, high above the muddy terrain where social conflicts are fought out. But the legitimacy of a claim to knowledge is ultimately inseparable from the legitimacy of the social institutions which produce knowledge. Right? Knowledge is not just a mental process, but a social process, and is therefore necessarily caught up in the broader structures of domination and resistance that shape society. Knowledge and power, truth and justice cannot be so easily separated. Which is why whenever modern liberal universities have sought to explain their existence, justify their existence, they've always implicitly recognized precisely this relationship between knowledge and power. Typically, universities try to have it both ways by proclaiming that they pursue science for its own sake, but also then adding that they also have the purpose of something like the spiritual and moral training of the nation, which is the phrases from the University of Berlin at its founding. So throughout the modern era, universities have tried to make themselves useful by generating and circulating intellectual frameworks through which ruling elites can govern and profit, but also claiming to be above such considerations. And there was a way that that contradiction could be somewhat resolved, provisionally resolved, because precluding academia from social or political commitments was not incompatible with scholarship that was clearly financed and organized in ways that were intended to serve political or economic interests. The capitalist funding of university research, either directly or through grants or indirectly through taxation, rests on the assumption that pure or general research programs should be financed, even if there's no immediate profitable application, because it's impossible to predict where the kind of decisive and therefore most useful intellectual breakthroughs are going to come. Right? So this assumption then supports the principle of a general social interest in knowledge that makes possible the notion of academic freedom, but with all the ambiguities that you can imagine such an arrangement brings. Wertheim, for example, was able to wield the principle of academic freedom to protect himself against pressures to conform to neo-colonial interests. On the other hand, disciplines like Orientalism could claim to be exemplars of academic freedom, even as they were constituted out of European colonial imperatives. So when, in the aftermath of Nazism, Ruth Benedict proposed that universities promote a kind of liberal anti-racist doctrine to the public, she was both challenging older racist scholarship, but also remained within the tradition of academic knowledge as reflecting intellectual frameworks that support elite interests, because liberal anti-racism in the second half of the 20th century became officially sanctioned. Now, at the same time that this liberal anti-racism was forming in Europe and the United States, a radically different way of thinking about racism was taking shape in the places that Europe had colonized. And it was developing amongst scholars working outside of universities. Right? So Anton de Kom was one example. Another was the Trinidadian writer C.L.R. James, who in a 1938 article on racism in Africa, again, he's using that word racism in 1938, just at the moment when it's becoming used by Hirschfeld in English. He argued that British colonial racism was not a set of beliefs or attitudes, but a structure of generally observed social rules and policies that enabled white economic exploitation of African land and labour. By 1956, the Martinican psychiatrist Frantz Fanon was arguing that we should abandon the habit of what he called regarding racism as a disposition of the mind, a psychological flaw. Rather, he says, military and economic oppression most frequently precedes, makes possible, and legitimates racist beliefs. And this systematic oppression of a people, as he puts it, can continue even if a majority of the citizens do not have racist biases, whether they're held consciously or not. So, of course, the radical anti-racist understood that racism could be seen in the individual attitudes, prejudices and dogmas of some members of the societies they were writing about, but more significant to them were the ways that land, labour and rights were socially and politically organised through racist structures that had a coherence and a necessity of their own. And so race provides a means by which capitalism can more intensively exploit certain categories of worker, the enslaved, the indentured, the colonised peasantries, the migrant workers, as well as provide a way to justify discarding peoples who are deemed superfluous to the economy. As Stuart Hall put it, race is the modality in which class is lived. Now, moreover, scholars like de Combe, C.L.R. James and Frantz Fanon emphasize the ways that the structure of racism shifted in line with broader shifts in political and economic systems. Fanon, for example, in his lecture on racism and culture, delivered in 1956, argued that racism, as he says, has to renew itself, take on new shades, change its physiognomy, in line with the broader structure it's a part of. So he could already at that time see that what he called the vulgar, primitive and simplified beliefs in biological differences between the races were giving way to what he called more subtle arguments that amounted to a cultural racism, targeting a certain way of life, right? Think of anti-Muslim racism there that he's anticipating. He argued that racist domination was going to increasingly hide itself in abstract economic processes, such as systems of land ownership and international trade rules. The truth is, he says, that the rigor of the system makes it superfluous to make a daily assertion of superiority, right? He's saying you can have a system of domination that doesn't need to be constantly vocalized through racist abuse on the street or the cops calling you a racist epithet, right? The system doesn't need that anymore. Even this, in this new moment, Fanon says, the celebration of cultural diversity can itself be part of the way that structural racism maintains itself, right? He says there is a respect for the traditions, the cultural peculiarities, the personalities, right, of colonized peoples, so long as these cultures are represented, he says, in a mummified way, right, so that they cannot pose a political threat. Now, that's a pretty exact description of the situation we find ourselves in today, right? Structures of domination operating through abstract economic processes that are largely illegible and invisible, systems of violence that carry out racial oppression in seemingly race-neutral ways, right, such as counter-terrorism, counter-migration, counter-narcotics, right? The celebration of cultural diversity is an official doctrine alongside all of that, right? Liberal anti-racists have succeeded over the last half-century in reducing racial prejudices in interpersonal relationships, right? That's where there's been success. But that's also compatible with the new system that's emerged, right? Liberal anti-racism is powerless against the new forms of racial domination that have emerged in the neoliberal era since the 1970s. I'm thinking of the vast expansion of border infrastructure since the 1970s, the global war on drugs, the global war on terror, the warehousing of millions of people in prisons and refugee camps around the world, right? Liberal notions of diversity and inclusion are completely compatible with these forms of structural violence, right? White liberals can heroically confront their own unconscious biases all they want, yet these structures will remain. Because when liberals demand that we use the correct racial vocabulary, they fail to see that abolishing a word does not abolish the social forces it expresses. They fail to see that when you implement diversity training programs, you're doing so on the mistaken premise that racism somehow now is in the unconscious mind and it can be challenged on that basis, right? And when liberals talk about hate speech and hate crimes, they're assuming that oppression is the kind of outcome of a hateful disposition, right? Ignoring the fact that you have corporate executives, asset managers, lawmakers, government officials, judges, police officers, prison guards, military personnel, immigration officers, who, without attitudes of hatred, routinely and quite calmly operate infrastructures of racist violence in the name of either security or profit, right? So take, for instance, the United States border regime. In 2021, that is under the Biden administration, not Trump, right? More than 1 million, mainly Mexican people, were expelled from the United States. Okay. Why did that happen? Well, take a look at one piece of that border at the cities of Juarez and El Paso, which is basically a single conurbation that's divided by a militarized border that cuts that cuts half of that city in Mexico and the other half in the United States. Right? On the Mexican side, the wages are 1/5 of what they are on El Paso for the same work. Right? So that means that a corporation can move its production from the United States side to the Mexican side and immediately dramatically increase its profits, which of course is what has been happening since the 1970s. Right? It also means that on the United States side of the border, you can have an undocumented migrant workforce that can be exploited all the more heavily because of the special policing powers that it can be subjected to. Right? Try organising to form a trade union amongst undocumented workers. You pop your head up and try that work, you'd get deported. Right? So, like Jim Crow in the US South or apartheid in South Africa, it's a form of racial segregation between different parts of the working class, right? That enables capital accumulation, right? So people who say that capitalists want a borderless world are quite wrong. They want a borderless world for capital, but not for labour, okay? Because the version of capitalism that's existed since the 1970s profits from borders. Right? And that's why we've had a massive expansion of the infrastructure that polices those borders since the 1970s, right? And why that infrastructure maintains an international global racial division of labour, right? And the same applies in Europe as in the United States, right? And this is why both liberal and conservative political parties support these processes of bordering. The extent to which public opinion is anti-immigrant is not a cause of the policy, but the result of it. Okay? The real cause of the policy comes from these economic processes, not from public opinion. But you cannot have a border regime in Europe that literally shoots Africans attempting to enter Europe and kills them by gunfire. Right? If you can't have that and not expect that to infect domestic politics. Right? You can't be liberal at home and fascist abroad. Right? Sooner or later, that contradiction unravels. Right? That's the lesson that Aimé Césaire taught us, right? About the colonial boomerang. Right? If you practice racist violence abroad, expect it to return to your own society. Right? The real origin of Nazism is in European colonialism. Right? The genocides began in southern Africa, right? Before they came home to Europe. Right? And similarly, Donald Trump is the anti-Muslim racism of the war on terror coming home. Right? Now, if racism is able to regenerate itself in new ways, as I've been arguing, then we also have to continuously update the weapons we wield in the struggle against racism. And that means that anti-racism is in part an intellectual project, right? Not one of debunking the false ideas in the racist belief system, as the liberal account has it, but of developing an accurate account of the role of racism within a broader set of social and economic relationships. Right? That was the work that Anton de Kom and C.L.R. James and Frantz Fanon and Stuart Hall were all doing. Right? 3 of those 4 were doing it outside of universities. Can that work be done inside universities? Right? To some extent, this was what the 1968 generation attempted when it began what it called its march through the institutions from the 1970s, and it entered the universities as educators and began to shape the culture of academia. Right? They questioned the idea of a value-free academia and tried to rethink the university as an institution that could train and serve humanity as a whole rather than just governing elites. And they tried to explicitly connect academic knowledge to anti-racist and decolonial struggles. Now, the implications of that were both radical but also ambiguous, right, in ways that I think we need to acknowledge. So, on the one hand, that provided institutional space for a more radically democratic form of knowledge. But for that very reason, there was a danger that the march through the institutions would end up by absorbing radical possibilities from outside the institutions and then deadening them in the processes of bureaucracy, right? So that academia would become a kind of graveyard for liberation movements, where their memory was preserved but devoid of life. And in retrospect, it seems that the centering of universities as, I think probably by the 21st century, as the key site of left-wing politics in the Western world, right? That's gone hand in hand with a kind of gentrification of the left, separated the production of knowledge from the necessity of collective organising. And I feel that many of the worst practices of today's left seem to originate in the academy, right? A kind of top-down sensibility in relation to knowledge production, a tendency to moralism, disconnected from political process, and a kind of descent into lifestyle politics at the expense of genuinely collective action. And of course, this has all been exacerbated by the kind of neoliberal governance of universities that has led to this kind of appropriation of anti-racism into a tick-box mentality of ethnic headcounts and the empty spectacles of liberal multiculturalism. Plus a transformation in the kinds of knowledge that elites have desired, right? So if imperialism once wanted disciplines like Orientalism as part of its process of colonization, that's today, I think, increasingly redundant, right? The Middle East studies departments are no longer useful to empire. And indeed, you know, they are being shut down in the United States, at least, for that reason. What imperial interests want instead is projects like, if you look at Fotini Cristia's work at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which involved acquiring a data set of all cell phone metadata in Yemen over a period of time in order to try to correlate patterns of cell phone use to what she calls political or violent activities as they unravel in real time. So this is the collapse of scholarly knowledge, really, into a form of surveillance. Now, university administrators today seem committed to helping destroy the basic principles of scholarship, I would argue, in order to turn their institutions into hubs of real estate investment, corporate partnerships, and police repression. But to repeat, as scholars, the intellectual liberation we aim at for ourselves and for our students is intimately linked to a broader human liberation from social and political oppression. Right? Our intellectual growth and our social and political growth are mutually reinforcing. Right? And that's a legacy of the European Enlightenment we need to defend. And that means we have almost like a scholarly obligation to oppose the most egregious forms of human oppression, particularly when our own governments are complicit. Yet we see the stars of a neoliberal university more often than not refuse to take even the most basic humanitarian stand in the face of censorship, thuggery, and genocide. In the United States, the universities have become a major target for far-right mobilization, not because they're doing much in the way of anti-racism, but because they carry within them a kind of trace of the more radical possibilities that have occasionally opened up. It's worth noting that the ground for the far-right assault on universities in the United States under Trump was prepared by liberal attacks on universities in the Biden period. Right? While the United States was fully participating in Israel's genocide in Gaza, America's liberal establishment focused its efforts on claiming that students speaking out against Israel were calling for the genocide of Jews, and then denouncing this figment of their own imagination. No serious evidence was ever given for this rise in anti-Semitism on US campuses. We were all just expected to understand that people calling for Palestinian rights are somehow anti-Semitic. And then in Congress, we saw the presidents of Harvard University, University of Pennsylvania, and MIT all summoned to answer accusations that they'd failed to restrain their students, and they were forced to resign. So you had a situation where Palestinians were being slaughtered on an industrial scale in a genocide sponsored by the United States, but the only people shamed into resigning were university presidents who did not do enough to censor Palestinians, right? And meanwhile, in Gaza, of course, the universities, the libraries, the archives have all been completely destroyed. The professors murdered, the students killed or displaced, right? So universities will destroy themselves if they do not recognize that the commitment to intellectual liberation is tied to the commitment to human liberation. And that intimacy produces very practical institutional obligations. To protect the intellectual project of enlightenment, universities have to commit themselves to not only the intellectual critique of oppression, but also use whatever institutional power they can to offer practical support to the cause of human freedom. When governments practice genocide or torture, such as Israel is currently doing, there must be a complete isolation from that regime and its agencies, even agencies that seem to have an educational purpose. There has to be an academic boycott of Israel. University investment funds must divest from Israel. The right of students and professors to speak out, demonstrate and organise against Zionism must be absolutely upheld. We must be allowed without reservation to identify Zionism as a form of racism and colonialism. We must be allowed to denounce it without equivocation. Beyond that, we need to create the institutional spaces where we can develop strategic thinking about how to overcome the multiple crises of today. Right? The systems of mass elimination of surplus populations, from the violent border infrastructures and mass incarceration to campaigns of high-tech genocide. The environmental crisis that cannot be understood outside of the questions of racism and colonialism. Right? The ever-increasing inequality both within and between nations. The hollowing out of democratic representation itself. And finally, the crisis of social knowledge, our inability to develop a collective understanding of the world-spanning social systems that govern our lives, an understanding that we need in order to change them. Right? So this is what we need. We need the institutional space to ask, where do we want to be in 30 years? Right? What kinds of change can we imagine making over that time period? What kinds of social and political organisation would we need to build to bring that about? What kinds of things would these organisations need to do? Where is the collective spaces where these conversations can take place? Right? Can the university do that? Without that, we're doomed to reactive moments of outrage. More or less spontaneous revolts brought together through social media, which can never be developed into a coherent process of change. Right? So to be anti-racist today means working collectively to dismantle racist border, policing, carceral and military infrastructures. It means understanding that the poor of the global south are as equally entitled to the world's resources as the wealthy residents of the north. And in the end, it means building a different economy of care, not killing, uplifting all working classes of whatever colour. Thank you. I'll stay here, right? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much
Sure.
for your beautiful talk. We now have quite a bit of time for questions and discussion. So we will come around with the mic. We want to take questions in groups, so 2 or 3 at a time. So if anyone has a question, please go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
So I have first a quick comment and then a question relating the title, I guess. First a quick comment, namely about Anton de Kom. I'm somehow a junior lecturer at university, but I'm also sitting here as a member of the Dutch Communist Party. And we tend to have the critique of people talking about Anton de Kom that they fail to mention the communist aspect of his trajectory or something. And so just a small comment, like maybe mention that. Sure. Not as a, I don't know, doesn't matter. Do with it what you want.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. Especially in the Netherlands, where in his book, like in the preface, people write about him that it's contested or something. No, we went to Moscow, we found his card. It's not contested. Then a second question. I think the question about can universities be anti-racist can also be reframed a bit. So there's a collective level, but also the individual level. And the collective level is like, how do universities as functions of the state propose, or I don't know, further class rule or something? But at the individual level, an interesting question to me is also, how can we as workers further the class struggle within the university? Is that only at the practical level of there's budget cuts and we need to make sure that we have as much budget as we can? Or is there also like an ideological component of writing books, giving talks like these? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a really awesome talk. I was just a little bit curious, you know, I feel like since January there is quite a lot of, again, debate about like what liberalism sort of brought, and you know, and I think among some sort of US American leftists there is a bit of this discussion about like how identity politics replace the actual issues, you know, and again it's like sort of like this binary thinking, which I find a little bit kind of troubling. And I was a little bit curious, like, what do we do with the liberals? Like, to what, like, because sometimes I'm curious to what extent we are now also engaged in this contestation, like, okay, liberals were wrong, we should have done this and that, whereas some other things are still going on. Like, what, do you see any space for actual cooperation? I don't know. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like to answer those?
Sure,
Yeah.
okay. So, yeah, so one way of answering your question about Anton de Kom is read the book. It's in the book that he's a communist. I didn't actually know that that's actually been confirmed in terms of membership.
It says in the book he's not. That's where it becomes.
In which book?
In
I'm talking about my book.
Oh, sorry.
I'm promoting my book now. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that he was a communist, and that clearly shapes his point of view. I think I would simply add that what that means for us today is not straightforward, right? Because one of the things about being a member of the Communist Party in the 1930s and 1940s is for it gives you a kind of language for internationalism, right? Above all, like I think for someone like Anton de Kom, fighting the struggles that he's fighting in the various locations that he's based at different times in his life, it provides a way for him to be able to recognize comrades, right, in an international struggle, right? And we aren't in that situation now, where there is a single political party or even a single narrative that will do that work, right, of enabling us to make those connections, right? So the challenge is, and I don't know that we necessarily need one narrative, but we need some way of allowing all of our struggles in different parts of the world to recognize each other as being connected, right? That was the beauty of the Communist Party in that period, and what we are so lacking now that we can't get by rebuilding the Communist Party of the 1930s because we're in a different time, right? So I think that's what it makes me think about. I mean, and in terms of the second part of your question about, I mean, absolutely, for individuals within universities, whether whatever kind of work they do there, the obligation, I think, is to be organised as workers, just like any worker struggle, right, to adjust the balance of economic resources and political power in relation to your employers, right? But then there's some specific things to do with the role of the university as an institution of knowledge, right, where the ideological question takes on a particular character, right? And yes, that is also an area of absolutely where we should be engaging. And I hope the thrust of what I was saying, I'm hoping that it gives people some useful tools and material to engage in precisely that kind of ideological work. Now, on the question of identity politics and liberals, okay, so maybe if you don't mind, I will just park the piece of this that's about identity politics, because that would take me about 10 minutes. But the other part of it is to do with what should, if you take the view that some kind of more radical anti-racist politics, for example, is necessary, then what would your relationship to liberals look like? Well, I think in the case of, say, the United States in the current context, and probably the Netherlands in the current context as well, those of us who are on the left and want this more kind of radical approach, we are way too marginal and we don't have the power to assert ourselves right now in the way that we would want. So we are inevitably in some kind of relationship with the much more powerful liberal constituency in these societies, right? So what we can do that is, I think, going to give us the greater strength than our numbers, as it were, right? How we can punch above our weight is we have an argument to liberals about how liberals destroy themselves unless they become more like us, right? That's essentially the argument, right? And it's not like a spin, that's accurate, right? I mean, liberals are constantly destroying themselves. Some of them because they are so attached to their funders and their corporate interests that they're not really committed to the liberal principles they believe in. But, you know, for significant numbers, principled liberals fail to see how they undermine those principles through a constant process of fighting the wrong battles in the wrong way, right? So that's where I think we come in and make that pitch to our liberal temporary friends. They're our temporary friends right now, right? And we can be honest about that and straightforward about that in the context of, you know, the rise of the far right. It's the hour of the far right right now around the world, right? So in that context, we have temporary liberal friends, and our friendship is based on we have some better ideas for how you can act in your own interests.
More questions?
I want to ask a question about what's the relationship between decolonialization of our knowledge, because students in the anthropology department seems to be very passionate about decolonization of our knowledge. They complain that most of the books they read are written by old white men. They want to read more non-Western authors from the global South. But unfortunately, because many of the works are not written in the English language, it's not easy to have access. So my question is, how can this decolonialization of our knowledge, this initiative, avoid reproducing the Ruth Benedict thing, you know, educating people, trying to change the way people think, which reinforce the idea that racism is about mentality. You know, how can we still perform our function as educators while avoiding the, you know, to adopt a more radical way, anti-racist way in our role as educators? Thank you.
Okay.
Some more questions.
Hi, thank you so much. I was just wondering, so you're talking about like more structures of oppression and that are really key to these races, to racism. Your book title is, of course, like why it should be anti-racism should be anti-capitalist. Are these structures of oppression always and only capitalist or primarily capitalist? You also spoke a little bit to kind of anti-immigrant sentiments and populism. And I wonder, I would love to hear whether there's like, if you see really capitalism as a kind of, really the kind of source, the kind of motor of this, or we might also think of, for instance, state structures, other kind of, you know, like also structural forces and structuring forces that might be linked to and kind of related to or interacting with, but not necessarily only capitalism.
Okay. So just on this question of the decolonization of knowledge and education. So just to clarify, I don't think there's anything wrong with professors educating their students, right? I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm questioning, and nor do I think there's anything wrong with professors educating the public, right, in general, through public engagement. But it's more the problem with that kind of Ruth Benedict version of anti-racism is the misunderstanding of what racism is, right? Rather than the fact that they're attempting this public education, and it's the misunderstanding of what racism is that leads it to be moralistic and top down. It's not the fact of them talking to the public or talking to their students, right, in an educational role that leads it to be top down and moralizing. So that's just to clarify that. But on the the question of the broader question you raised, I think that. Firstly, this is always going to be very context dependent, right? So it's going to be hard to kind of offer general prescriptions. But the kind of concerns you raised are at the heart of, all the kind of issues are kind of implied in what you raised, right? Like, why are certain languages considered the default languages to do that kind of research and education, right? I mean, that's a product of colonial history, right? Why are most of the texts written by white men from, say, the 20th century? Because they were fortunate enough to be in the institutions that had the economic and cultural power to do that work, right? So I think, part of what's being quite rightly demanded here is a kind of... for me, it doesn't come down to, is the person who wrote the book white or not white? I mean, that might be, some consideration. But I think the more fundamental consideration is what kind of institutions do we have and what kind of resources do we have for doing the kind of work we need, right? And it ultimately, the question of, is the author white or not, is only, for me, a means to think about that bigger question, right? We need to build institutions that can produce liberatory knowledge, and that can't be done unless some of the ways that universities work in Europe and the United States are, quite deeply changed, right? Including what the citations look like, including what the curricula look like, right? All of those things need to be questioned, and we're gonna have to move to a situation where we do the harder work of embracing work in other languages, embracing work that comes out of unconventional, by our standards, institutional origins, and so on and so forth, right? Most of the in the area of work that I'm involved in, most of the most profound intellectual insights have come from people who weren't at universities, weren't doing that work at universities, right? And so that just seems to me a basic kind of requirement for doing, raising those questions and pushing ourselves seems to me a basic requirement for doing intellectual work at this time. Of course, there's the question of resources, but that's a site of struggle rather than a way of shutting down that opening that I think we're looking for. The question about capitalism. So, I mean, what I'm interested in my work is the relationship between racism and capitalism, right, and how they interact. I don't imagine that in terms of capitalism is this kind of machinery that just produces all these outcomes in terms of racism. It's not so mechanical, right? And so I would argue that, of course, there are forms of racism that have existed outside of capitalism, and if we weren't in a capitalist world, then there could be other forms of racism that could exist outside of it. But what's very important for me is that what you see through the modern era, I would argue, is that is the way that capitalism took, the forms of prejudice, intolerance, cultural attitudes, and so on that circulated all around the world before capitalism. It took that kind of raw material, right, that we might call racism, in that pre-capitalist period, or we might think of casteism in India, for example. It took all that raw material and then institutionalized it in entirely new modern ways, right? That made it both harder to unravel and challenge, and also gave it a different kind of cultural and social power, right? Because once you have a capitalist system that finds racism functional to it, which is what I think we have throughout the last, throughout the modern era, 400, 500 years, then it's ultimately now a power structure that rests on the power of the capitalist class, right? Which is a very powerful battle to fight if you want to try and fight that battle. It's a very different thing from trying to challenge someone's misconceptions, right? Which is a different problem, right? So that's why I think it's important to bring in the question of capitalism. And then on the question of, you see, when we talk about the state, see, if we go back to that example I gave in the talk about immigration, one way of thinking about why do we, it's clear that since the 1970s, right, we've had every couple of years we get a new piece of legislation that says we need tougher immigration controls, right? Whether you look at the Netherlands, anywhere else in Europe, the United States, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and that goes back to the 1970s, right? It's year in, year out. We have more and more technology, more and more surveillance to control these borders, yeah? Now, is that being driven by politicians in the state who are responding to public opinion in a way that a well-functioning democracy is imagined to do, right? It seems to me the evidence is not for that. After all, if you think especially about the United States, the political class in the United States hardly ever responds to public opinion, right? Like if you look at this is the data, the research that was done by political scientists probably about 12 years ago now, where they correlated from thousands of public opinion polls across the United States between public opinion and policies on across every policy area. And in a well-functioning democracy, that line of the relationship between public opinion and policy should look like a nice 45-degree line, right? A different kind of policy should reflect a different kind of public opinion. It turns out in the United States, at least back then, I think it probably still be true now, that the line is almost horizontal. In other words, public opinion has zero effect on policy making in the United States, right? And that's been true for some decades, right? Then you track what does policy making, how does it correlate to corporate preferences? Very good correlation, right? So it's not, so if you think that the border policies in the United States are the result of public opinion, you have to say, how come just on that issue politicians respond to public opinion, but they don't on any other issue, right? Which tells you that it's not coming from public opinion, it's coming from something else, right? And then I would argue that it's coming from the need of capitalists to have a racial division of labour, right? So the state is secondary there to that capitalist need, and then public opinion is also secondary because public opinion is the kind of cultural and ideological consequence of capitalist-funded think tanks and media that are constantly putting out this idea that nations are under threat from immigrants, right? So that's how I would see the process. It is about that relationship between racism and capitalism there. Yeah.
Time for more questions. This one there.
Hi, thanks a lot. I was wondering if, coming from energy humanities, thinking about green energy transitions, if capitalism and racism are interacting and keeping on shape-shifting in a way, which I also see in what I read and research, these Western sustainability / green narratives are the latest shape, maybe one of the latest shapes of their ongoingness. and our universities are kind of moving also along in that direction, it seems, of green growth and geoengineering, and then invisibilizing the military-industrial complex that's so tied to it, and all the environmental racism and omissions that are part of that, and that also keep up the greenness of Europe and the US, for example, so-called. So where do you see openings maybe to challenge or resist that? Is it in academia at all? Like maybe in degrowth or post-growth or something else? But how much can we really put our hope in the universities of the West, especially as they are now, to really imagine these radical otherwises? To question that. Because there's so many dependencies, as you mentioned, there's more and more ties also. Thanks.
Just one more question.
So I'm speaking from the position of South Africa, where we didn't have a lot of openness and space in our universities historically, and where we had those spaces, they were often used by radical activists as spaces to support the labor movement and the liberation movement from. And it's quite disillusioning post-apartheid to see that space in a way opening up, but then a new liberal reforms coming in and in a way marketizing those spaces. But I do want to, your focus is essentially on universities in Europe and in North America. But in a way, my worry is from a position of authoritarian societies in the global South, that small space of freedom where you can reflect with colleagues and where you can work in tandem with movements. It's often a very difficult relationship because movements can also be authoritarian that you work with. I just want to, in a way, there also needs to be an internationalism between universities in the global North and the global South. And often these spaces here can provide a moment of freedom for people who operate in conditions of repression. So I'm starting to ramble now, but I just think it's the fighting for academic freedom is a global fight. And it's not only in the global North, and I think you need to involve, or you need to think about the institutions in the global South as well, because in a way what's happened to us is now coming to the US. It was so sad to thinking now that maybe we should provide refuge for American colleagues in South Africa from thought police. Thanks.
There's maybe time for one more question before the answer. Does there anyone else have a question? Yeah, Jorge in the back.
Hi, thank you so much. If the university, the liberal university, is doing so bad, like it's bad theory, it's completely functional to the system, do you have kind of a hypothesis why the far right is going after that non-operational liberal university?
Okay, thank you. So, let me. I mean, in relation to this question about green energy transitions, it's not an area that I have a lot of knowledge and I can add much to. But I think what you said sounds accurate to me. I think that we. Clearly, the whole question of the climate crisis is a colonial question, right? It's like obviously driven by the consumption historically of the kind of Western industrialized world, and its biggest impacts are going to be in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, right? In terms of the environmental destruction, and and so we're going to face a situation where, at some point in the next, who knows how many years, half of Bangladesh might be unlivable. Where are those people going to live? These are the kind of crises we're going to come up against. And I think we're actually past the point at which the most powerful kind of entities in the US and in Europe are even willing to engage in a conversation about that as something that the sort of ideology of green transition that we might have a critique of may not even be the most important way of thinking about this anymore. And so, then it's a very different picture. We don't have a kind of thing where we can try and hold some kind of green transition narrative and say, well, you're not doing what you promised in terms of green transition because it's a smokescreen to cover up the continuation of the fossil fuel agenda. But we may not even have that ability to kind of expose a contradiction. It might just be straightforward, brazen. We're going to just carry on, and either deny that there's any impact or just say we don't care. So then it's a much more kind of direct kind of battle of political forces, rather than something you can engage in that other way. The question of, I completely agree with what you're saying about the question of universities in the global south. I think part of what's happened is that in the United States, it's precisely that role between universities in the United States and people of the global south, students coming to the United States to study, bringing knowledge, right, of struggles in the global south into the United States. That's precisely what's being targeted, right? Whether that's in terms of knowledge of the Palestinian struggle, but also more generally, right? So, and this connects to the last question as well, as to why are the far right going after universities? I think. I suggested in the talk that it's because there's an understanding that although there's an understanding that universities have a possibility and a potential to be something different, even if they're not acting on it now, right? And that at certain times in the past they have done something different, and particularly, it's not just, if you look at the Trump policies on universities, for example, it's not simply an attack on. It's not that they want to get rid of universities. Right? They want to transform universities into something else, right? So you have to look at what is their vision of what the universities they would like are, right? And it's obvious that what they want is, universities that are geared towards the military-industrial complex, where kind of critical humanities are removed, connections to other parts of the world are removed, right? Students from other parts of the world are removed. Professors from other parts of the world are removed, unless it's their imagined ideas of good white Europeans and white South Africans who they're welcoming into their vision of America now, right? So and they're using, what's striking about it is how they're using the very liberal diversity politics that they critique. They're using that same infrastructure of kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're using that same infrastructure to achieve their political transformation of universities, right, through the accusation of anti-Semitism, right? So they're saying, we're going to send those students home, we're going to send those professors out of the country because they're anti-Semitic, and they're mobilizing the post-civil rights institutional arrangements in American universities that are meant to be protect against discrimination, right? So it's not quite right that the far right in the United States are straightforwardly opposed to DEI, right? They will use it for their purposes, and it's amenable to their purposes in certain contexts, right? So I think it's actually quite a complex picture when you look at how these struggles are playing out in relation to universities. Obviously, the question arises as to whether you want to mount a defense of critical humanities, international students, international professors, in the name of a kind of narrow idea of academic freedom, right? The sort of traditional liberal notion of academic freedom, or if you want to mount a more radical defense like the one I've been advocating, right? And I think that the true, the only honest way of doing this is to say what we want universities to be about is about not just intellectual liberation but human liberation, right? I think that's the only way to fight these battles, and this is an example of that thing that I was mentioning earlier about the argument we make to liberals to help them to help themselves, right? They're not going to win the battle to defend universities on their narrow terms. They need a broader vision, I think, of how to understand these struggles and how to frame them. And that's something that the left in the US or in Europe, I think that's where its role comes in on these questions. Thank you.
So thank you, and we now invite you to join us for a drink at the back. There's also a book sale back there, so please take a look, get your book signed by the author. Thank you.
Depends what's going to be Yeah, maybe I'll get it.